Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is episode 2, and I spoke with Ralph Horowitz. Ralph began in sports media before transitioning into full-time betting. He is a prominent and opinionated horse racing professional in Australia. We covered the current horse racing industry and some of the challenges it faces, as well as his insights with regards to data, innovation, and media. Before we go to Ralph, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and potential guests you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Ralph Horowitz. I'm joined by Ralph Horowitz. Hopefully we can have an exciting chat about, your foray into the betting world and what's going on in your life. So thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, absolute pleasure, Jake, and look forward to having a bit of a chat. I've yet to hear the podcast you did with Sean Byrne, but really looking forward to listening to it. I just didn't want to realise how bad I would be in comparison.
No, that's good. We've got Dominic Burns coming up as well, and then a few others, so I'm sure you'll fit in nicely.
Well, I'll just preface everything by just saying one of the greatest learning experiences I had in my life was a horse called Ranger, and I was privileged to be on air with Dominic Byrne, and this was on RSN in Melbourne about 5-6 years ago. I was doing my best and thought I knew a little bit of what I was talking about, and a horse called Ranger was having its first start in Melbourne from Perth, and I said, I think it would lead because I think it was drawn wide and, it led once in a Perth race, so I thought they'd be aggressive. And Dominic, who is an absolute gentleman, apart from being a legend of wagering, said basically tore me limb from limb, but completely politely, and more than that was more than entitled to, because I just didn't know enough at the time. I didn't realise that horse wasn't fast enough. That's simple. It wasn't fast enough. And it was such a good lesson for me. And as I said, Dominic was very, very polite in doing so, but just picked apart why that couldn't possibly happen. So as soon as we finished, I just thought, my knowledge isn't good enough. I'm doing my best, but my knowledge isn't good enough. And that was a great lesson. And as a mate of mine often says, the best way to learn in this caper is to lose money. And that's one of the few areas of life where that is the case.
Don't worry, I think it's mutual. After talking with Dominic for a while on the podcast episode, we all have plenty to learn, and he's one of the guys we can all learn from. And I think a few things you mentioned then we'll touch on as we go, but I think from the outset it'd be great to just for you to chat about your background a little bit, how you were involved in the betting industry growing up, and then how you got involved more recently.
Look, I'll probably be the smallest real punter that you speak to, and by that I mean, as far as what I spend of my own money on a bet, but maybe I'm the biggest because I've chosen about 5 years ago to go completely chips in, to mix gambling metaphors, and start up this an app called Racetrack Ralphie, which has been my pseudonym for years, and which I'll get to, and my website. And as such, every time I publish anything, as far as information, with it being a midweek meeting or the Saturday meetings, which are my key business on Victorian racing, I consider that my business is on the line. And when my business is on the line, and you're 48 like I am with a couple of kids who are pretty young, and you have mouths to feed and private school fees and everything else, that's a pretty big bet. So that's sort of where I am at the moment. But where I come from, I grew up in Caulfield, which is, for wherever you're listening to this in the world, it's a great, not only a great racetrack itself, with the Caulfield Cup being the iconic race, one of the iconic races of Australian racing, as most know, but also a training centre. And when some kids had paper rounds, remember newspapers? Are they still around? I mucked out boxes. So that became my love of racing, was hands-on with the animal. And I actually became a tradesman after a couple of years of being a strapper, and I thought, God, this isn't quite for me. I don't mind working hard, but the respect I have for people who are hands-on is never changed because of the 7-day-a-week relentless nature of the caper. I realised it wasn't for me. I became a tradesman, but then through a sort of roundabout way, I got into some racing media and was lucky enough to meet Eddie Maguire and Trevor Marmalade when they were starting a Triple M show, and that was their joint venture, if you like, or the dual media they were doing at the time with the footy show that became the dominant show in the Southern Seaboard, if you like, for a number of years. And through that became my real work. I was becoming a tradesman during the week and doing some radio on the weekend, and eventually I got a job at the footy show. So 8 years there, 9 footy seasons there. This is a long answer, but it's getting to where I'm going. And that taught me most areas of media. And while I was working in the footy media, it worked in beautifully with racing, because the way Melbourne racing works, you've got the Autumn Carnival, or the February-March Carnival, and obviously our iconic Spring Carnival. And that's bookends the footy seasons. That was my year for a lot of the time. But then I had to work out a different way of making a living when the narrow world of footy media ended for me, and joined RSN, and I was also a racing manager for a private guy who had a lot of horses, so I got to see a few different angles of the industry. But when it came to betting, I wasn't much good at it, and I've learnt the journey that I'm a much better analyst than I am an investor, and an idea was given to me to start an app, a race with as far as form was concerned, and I got into it boots and all, but where I was lucky was I met a guy called Vince Accardi at the same time, and he taught me how much I didn't know, which is why I'm giving you such a long answer. Hopefully it suits the podcast format, but he taught me how much I didn't know after following racing really since I was a young fella, as I said, in Caulfield from the late 70s to 5-6 years ago when I started working with Vince, and now I completely immerse myself in his work, do a lot of work alongside of him, and I've never been more engaged in watching and immersing myself in the sport, and never been less interested in the media coverage of it.
It's a fascinating journey, certainly, and you mentioned a few different aspects. I'm curious as to you mentioned the analyst side. There's obviously the handicapping or the selection side, so you've got to analyze the form and pick your horses and those type of things. Then you've also got the bankroll management, the money management side of it, which most people I speak to seem to separate those two, and quite often have different people or different responsibilities with those two different aspects. But then you, with your digital business and the app, you've obviously got clients you're responsible for those. Do you do all three aspects yourself, and is that a challenge?
Yeah, I'll try and break that down a few different ways. One is, I think, the biggest thing I've learnt, if someone said singularly, what is the biggest thing you've learnt, making the transition from a recreational punter and someone who just loves the sort of the elite side of the sport. By that I mean mainly Saturday racing and mainly stakes racing, like, the average horse racing fan, to someone who lives and breathes it and immerses myself in the data, and that is that your eyes lie to you. That's simple. If you watch enough ball sports and you've got any real brains about you, you can become an expert in those ball sports, particularly if you want to learn from others and what to look at and everything like that. With racing, peel it all back. Your eyes lie to you. You see things in races that you think are significant, i.e. an easy win by a slow horse, or a blanket finish with 3 or 4 horses who may be all very, very good. And because it's a driving blanket finish, you think, well, maybe there's a bit of a query about the form. So peel it all back, just look at how fast they run. And what staggers me, and what I think ultimately is the best edge, and this is all personalities aside, by the way, I'll use Twitter and so forth, Jake, for various areas if I want to have a battle, but I'll never use anyone else's medium, which is yours. But if before a 100-metre final, you will see how fast Usain Bolt runs, and you'll see how fast all 7 other runners run in a 100-metre Olympic final in the media previews of it. Before any feature race in anywhere in Australia, but I'll talk about Melbourne, which is my jurisdiction, you'll see notes in the main media, which is comparisons. In other words, this horse carried this much weight, now it carries this much weight, and it lost to this horse by 2 lengths, but it beat that horse by a length. It's comparisons, but it's not measurements. And measurements is how fast they run, and ultimately it's a race. So everything else you can break down, but I think the singular biggest thing you can learn from a handicapping point of view, to use the American phrase, or just the punt if you want to use an Aussie phrase, is just use the data, because the data tells you how fast they run, and then predictive analysis kicks in. So, as I said, I think my strength is being an analyst rather than an investor. But that's also because of personal circumstances. I meant when you start a business from scratch and your back's to the wall, you don't want to lose twice, and that is if you put your information isn't that good on any given Saturday, and let's face it, it's pretty volatile caper, and you have a bet as well, you've lost twice. Because my sales will go down if I have a bad run, and conversely, my sales will go up. So I had to take a pretty disciplined approach, given I've got mouths to feed. It's really important for me to say that the upside of winning twice isn't worth the downside of losing twice when it happens. So as I said to you, and I'm nice and upfront with people, I'm a much better analyst than an investor, and my skin in the game is hoping that my customers win off information I provide to them.
I think we'll touch on the data side of it a little bit more as we go. I'm interested in, from a personal point of view, certainly the weight side of things, for example. There's obviously a lot of variables that go into it. You mentioned that there's obviously the data element, then there's the predictive analyst type element also. Something like weight, what guides your opinion when it comes to weight? Because weight's been around they talk about the Doncaster and all these handicaps, and no one's ever won with a certain amount of weight and all those types of things. What, for example, for weight, what drives your opinion and what drives your, I guess, input as a variable for something like weight? Is it, different types of research? Is it opinion? Because some people will say it's critical and others may say that it's completely irrelevant.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't. I'm certainly not in the critical camp, and I'm not naive enough to say I'm not in the saying it's irrelevant either. I'm pretty comfortable in saying that it's the most overrated factor of form. So if I say the most underrated is that your eyes lie to you, so you need to use data because people overbet the visual. When it comes to weight, I think they overbet weight differentials. And you touched on something which I think means there's a real logical outcome to this. And that is, as you say, weight has been around for, I don't know, let's pick a number, 200 years or whatever when it comes to include the English horse racing. So you've been able to very accurately say how much weight a horse is carrying for all that amount of time. So that's been the dominant factor, along with margins, that the people have used. Be it pounds and differential, like in when it comes to English racing, or the kilos we use. But because you've had that and margins, that's been the factual things that people have been able to use. But what they haven't been able to accurately measure until relatively recently, let's say 10, 15, 20 years, whatever, but it's still relatively recently, is accurate speed. And ultimately, it's a race. It's a race between A and B. If you want to break it down the way Vince Ducardi does it in 3 sections. You can say it's a race between A and B, B and C, C and D, and whatever, A to D if you look at the overall. So, I mean, there's various fractions into a race that makes it even more fascinating. But what I am completely comfortable in saying is that the weight differential is completely overbet, and people look at it too often because too many times you see a kid riding a horse with no real competency, bouncing around all over it, and they go, wow, and the trainer put him on because, you get the all-important 3 kilo claim, to use the Australian vernacular. But ultimately, what about the lack of talent of the jockey? And, if the kid's bouncing around all the way compared to, a perfectly balanced senior rider, well, surely that's more important. So that's my long answer, but I do think that's my conclusion. I'm very comfortable with that. Weight is overrated. It's not irrelevant, but it's overrated when it comes to form study.
Yeah, okay. So there's obviously a lot of variables that go into it. There's no doubt about that. Is there more than one way to win, or is it ultimately a value-based betting strategy is the key to it?
Yeah, is it? Well, and then you peel it back even further and say what is actually value. The variable side of things, that to me is why I'm just so fascinated with this sport, and endlessly fascinated, and just so engaged with it. It does my head in, the amount of racing that we have in Victoria, because you have to keep up with it all. And anyone who's in this area will say similarly. But that creates opportunities. But the fascination of it mate of mine, Darren Potter, has a great phrase, and that is, it's like chess but more engaging. The people who are engaged in chess, I'm not. I was as a kid. There's only 64 squares on it, but how many millions of combinations are there? Well, you compare that to different distances, different jockeys, different starting prices that you have to take into account, different levels of fitness, different levels of talent of the trainer, where horses are ultimately aimed compared to on the day when you're having a bet. The variables are just sensational, and it does. It keeps you really sharp and on your toes. And then you try and find the value proposition from there. So as I said, I think where you have to peel it back is to say what is really value in racing media. In other words, you just give tips, 1 from 2 from 3 from 4. Well, then you can say, well, what about this $10 shot? That's good value. Well, that's fine, but you're gonna lose money in the long term if you back lots of horses at big odds, because most of them are short in the market. I'll say to my dying day, I'd be delighted if a better one comes along. But last year's Cox Plate, the best value we will ever see in our life is Winks, who was as much as $2.10 during the week and $1.90 on the day in the Cox Plate, where she was just so far superior to the rest of the field. I thought so pre-racing. That's what Racer definitely got right. We'll get them wrong too, but for her to be $1.90, well, that's how many times could they have run that race and her lost? I think is what you ask afterwards, and I would say probably they could have ran that Cox Plate 95, 96, maybe 98 times, and she would have lost. She would have won 95, 96, 98% of the times they ran the Cox Plate. So that tells you true odds was probably $1.02, and they're giving you $1.90. So that to me is what real value is in racing.
No doubt about that. So on the data side, what level of your analysis is, the data side compared to other elements, including, subjective elements such as, watching a trial and placing a numerical value by the eye test as opposed to the sectional side and the data side?
Yeah, so my starting point is always the data. And because the reality is if you use the data to say what did happen in a race, that means your starting point is factual. Before the predictive analysis kicks in. So, I completely immerse myself in Vince Accardi sheets that he puts out, both his daily summaries, which are just the winners, 200 sectionals and the leaders, as well as his what he calls IVR. And that's the more in-depth side of things, as opposed to, how many lengths above or below benchmark that horses run to the 800 metre mark, from the 800 to 400 and the last 400 of a race. So that tells you what did happen, and it's probably taken me, sort of call it Vince school. It's taken me like a uni degree, if you like. I'm 4 or 5 years into it, and I've got real confidence that I'm very good now at saying what did happen in a race. And now what I have to keep improving on and improve as long as I'm doing this caper, i.e. the rest of my life, is the predictive analysis side of things. So it's all data as your starting point, and then the predictive analysis comes in when you start using things like starting prices, i.e. why was a horse a certain price, and trainers' strike rates. Trainers try and think why a trainer's running a horse in a particular race, the talents of jockeys, the patterns of jockeys, and then how the track's going to play on the day. And unlike American racing, which is obviously on a very consistent surface, the Australian racing that's on turf 12 months of the year, and I concentrate on mainly city tracks, but they've got many variables, and the curators we have are sensational, but they have a very tough job because you don't see pro-ams being run at Augusta in the weeks leading up to the Masters or at all, but we ask our curators to race 52 weeks of the year and still peak on the big iconic days.
So what are maybe 1 or 2 or even 3 of the top values you place when it comes to the predictive side? Is it, and I've heard things like, the market itself, market intelligence and how the market's moving, or even something such as Betfair, which is a dangerous beast as far as I understand, but it can be a very valuable tool. Are they some of the things that you use in addition to your initial analysis?
Yeah, so my starting point is just how fast horses run. I mean, I think that's it sounds bleeding obvious, but it's amazing how few people do that. So what I do a little template for myself, which is the lengths above benchmark that the horse has done in its past 3 starts, and also what its lead speed has been. And the reason for that is it gives you a real likely setup of a of a race shape. And I think that's where the race shape is a term that I think is really coming into vogue, and it's overtaken speed maps, because often speed maps are really positioning maps. And by that I mean, so people say, well, that horse normally leads, so it'll be first, and that horse is a back marker, and it'll be last, and we'll fill in all the other bits. And really, once you, instead of doing that, try and look at what its capabilities are. In other words, how fast can it run when it's leading, and how much does it lack tactical speed if it normally settles at the rear. And there was a recent race at Bendigo, which I was really proud of myself as to how I got the map right, and that was a horse called Burning Front that won on Saturday in a feature. I just couldn't see this race not being run at murderous speed, because on my little template I saw that there was going to be 6 or 7 really, really fast leaders that were going to take on Burning Front. And it did, and the horse was gallant, but it blew out and ran, I think, 4th off the top of my head, but being really well backed. And that's where I say race shape, and that's where that template is so important as my starting point. So that then gives me a real feel for if it's likely to be run quickly or not quickly, and then what the talent required to win the race will be. I'll give you another example. Recently was the Newmarket Handicap, where I just couldn't see there being any pace in it. Now, wherever you listen to this in the world, Newmarket's meant to be our iconic sprint race in Melbourne in the autumn, and that's what happened. And I actually managed to find, for a small amount, a $34 winner, and that also tells you, by extension, that there's lots of inefficiencies in the market, because how could a $34 winner in Redkirk Warrior was its name win, and then afterwards the trainer say it's the best horse in my stable? So that's a pretty inefficient market. If they thought it was only a 3 in 100 chance of winning, but the trainer said it was the best horse in his stable, and it ran according to the speed map, i.e. perfectly positioned and an informed jockey, so all those variables had me bullish on it. And no, I'll get races wrong too, but you gotta not only learn from your mistakes, but you also got to learn from when you get it right. So yeah, that's my starting point. The template: how fast the race is likely to be, what level of talent is likely to be required, and then from there, how the track's likely to play. If you ask for 3 variables, that's probably it.
So the race shape is fascinating for me, because if I'm an owner of a horse that has some speed but may not have sustained speed, and it has enough speed to get out of the gate and get to the lead, and then obviously might have a decent 400-meter sprint, wouldn't it be beneficial for that horse to kick up, take the lead, and then start to slow down in the middle stages, and then try and kick off on the corner and use that sort of sharp sprint at the end? And then there might be other horses that are 800 to 1,000-meter sort of grinding horses that do have a decent last sectional, but it does take them a little while to wind up. Is it purely dependent on each horse in each situation? And do the jockeys, in your mind, are they aware of that, the strengths of the horses and the trainers, so that they can utilize that? Because there does seem to be a lot of opinions out there that every ride is a bad ride and things like that. Is it in the industry something, race shape and the abilities of the horse, is everyone well aware of that and can utilize that to the best of their ability?
The simple answer is no. It's amazing the amount of ignorance that is in the industry. So that provides two separate situations here. One is it provides you opportunities to bet against, because you go, well, these people don't know how good or bad this horse is, or they don't know its capabilities or lack of capabilities. But then what you learn through trial and error is that their stupidity leads to sorry, not stupidity is the wrong word. Their ignorance leads to bad tactics. And I'll give you a great example of this. Was the Australian Cup of 2016. Hugh Bowman ended up winning the race on a horse called Preferment. Pretty good horse, won a Derby. Now, he had also won the Turnbull in the autumn. In the spring. So the Australian Cup's in March, the Turnbull is in the autumn. 2,000 metres at Flemington at weight for age. So in other words, and the tracks, I'll tell you, were very similar and firm. So what we're talking is real apples to apples stuff. Now, when he won the Turnbull Stakes, He's a stayer. As I said, he's won a Derby and he's competed in a Melbourne Cup. That horse in the Turnbull Stakes came from virtually the back of the field. And then in the Australian Cup, Hugh Bowman rolled forward, sat outside the leader, ended up winning it on protest. But the point was, if he didn't roll forward, he would not have won the race. And the reason was race shape. And I've got the database in front of me here. So I'll tell you, in the Turnbull Stakes, when he came from last, he was going 0.8 or length below benchmark because the leaders were flying in front of him. Now, when he rolled outside the leader to win the Australian Cup, he was going 10 lengths below benchmark. So he was going, even though he was outside the leader in the Australian Cup compared to at the back of the field in the Turnbull Stakes, he was going 9 lengths slower. So it was the jockey's initiative that won in the race. And then after the race, the stewards questioned Hugh Bowman as to why he went forward. They didn't question the jockeys who showed no initiative and just lazily rode to their pattern. And what they did, they questioned the jockey on the winner who went 9 lengths slower because he went to a different pattern. Now, that to me tells you two things. One, that's why you back the elite jockeys, because they work it out like Hugh Bowman did. But it also tells you, two, that our stewards have insufficient knowledge when it comes to being able to police our sport properly. Because they shouldn't have asked Hugh Bowman anything. They should have patted him on the back and then asked the other jockeys who did nothing. And that to me is the prime example of the lack of intelligence that is out there, and how many more years it's going to take for owners, jockeys, trainers, and unfortunately stewards to actually catch up.
So how do you fix that then? Because it sounds like it's not necessarily clear-cut, but there's a way to evaluate the speed of the race, the pace of the race, not only from a speed map perspective, but like you mentioned, a race shape perspective. Can it be, implemented throughout the industry that there are certain ways to look at the races, and everyone may have, different capabilities as a horse and as a jockey, and each owner may want to slow the race down in the middle stages. Others might want it to be, helter-skelter for the first 800 to sort of, burn the fuel for everyone else. Is there a way that it can be sort of universally recognized or understood that there are elements of a race that should be considered beneficial and others that are just, adverse circumstances and cannot be tolerated? From a steward's perspective, and I don't mean cannot be tolerated, I mean they need to be considered in the full sort of scope of the whole race.
Well, absolutely, because I touched on that I was in the AFL media in the mid '90s, and here's an analogy that I often like using. When I joined, I suppose first Triple M and then the Footy Show, a guy called Ted Hopkins had got the ball rolling when it came to measuring AFL footy. Now, Ted was iconically famous for coming off the interchange bench in the 1970 grand final, which was played before the biggest ever then VFL crowd of 121,000, and Carlton did the biggest ever comeback from half time, and Ted kicked 4 goals as an unknown, and basically didn't play much more footy after that, and became lived his own life, but didn't really have much of an involvement in footy. But then he got back into it through coming up with a whole series of measurements for footy, and they were long kicks and short kicks and inside 50s and rebounds and tackles and gathers and pressures and all these other different variables that had never been measured before. And what happened from an on-field perspective, Dennis Pagan, the Kangaroos Team of the Century coach who coached 2 premierships in the 90s, and Eddie Maguire from a media perspective, both embraced Ted Hopkins and said, this bloke's onto something. So Eddie was promoting his work through the media side of things and saying, well, you're going to learn a lot more about footy if you start realising what happened. And Dennis Pagan started using it in what became the dominant side of the decade. He originally said to Ted Hopkins, you kicked 4 goals, but how'd you get them? How'd you kick them? How'd the ball come to you? And that got Ted working. So he started Champion Data, and eventually the AFL bought out Champion Data. Why did the AFL buy it out? Because they thought that this will make our sport a stronger sport if more people, via our media outlets that are paying good money to cover the sport, understand what's happening a lot more. And then they challenge things a lot more. And then since then you've had things like Supercoach or fantasy footy kick in, and that makes people even more engaged with the sport. So on one hand, it's easy for me to say, well, I get Vince Accardi's data and so do Vince's clients. But on the other hand, what's best for the sport is that everyone gets hold of Vince Accardi's data and IP. And if not Vince, could be someone else with algorithms. But I'll tell you what, Vince has got a 30-year head start on everyone else, and it's pretty good stuff. And then what that does, it makes you more engaged in racing, and you go, I got it wrong for that reason, or I got it right for that reason, and you're happy, or you're annoyed at yourself for reading it wrong. And that is the best way going forward, and no different to what you touched on. The stewards' dynamics, they wouldn't ask stupid questions like they asked Hugh Bowman, and they would ask more questions to riders who ride initiative-free races or happen to lead by big margins. And we had one in the Oaks last year called the Squiddy Spirit. What led by a big margin? Well, it wasn't going that fast, but every other jockey decided to leave it alone because it was 100 to 1 that led all the way and won. That is the power that comes from the right information. Stewards should have it, jockeys, trainers and owners should have it, and it'd be better for the sport. And in the end, as I said, as my starting point, it still becomes predictive analysis when it comes to trying to find a winner. It doesn't make the caper easy, but it makes you more engaged as a punting participant, and it makes you want to follow the sport year round, not just when there's big races going on, which is what the majority of people unfortunately do, wherever you are in the world.
Interesting, because on that thread with the champion data analogy, has there been any other innovations in the industry in the last 6, 12, 18 months? I'm sure when Betfair started, it may not have been what it is now, but it seems to be an essential tool, whether you utilize it every race day. It seems like it's a predictive or it's an analyst tool for a lot of people in the industry. Has there been anything else in that line in the last sort of 18 months that you can say has or will have an impact? No, is the short answer. And Betfair is actually a good case in point for the Australian racing industry as to how, I suppose, hopeless is the word. Maybe we're improving in certain areas. We are for change. I mean, I absolutely look at Betfair in the lead up to every single race I'm involved in, whether I'm playing or not, because wisdom of crowds. It's telling you, I call it the truth serum. It tells you what the market's thinking. It's not everything, but it tells you a big story as to market expectations, and particularly with, for instance, first-up horses. How fit are they when they come to play? Well, you can look at the mounting yard, but you also do yourself a favour and you look on Betfair, and there's some stables. As soon as they blow, they may as well be 1,000,000 to 1. So that's a good example of racing innovation, or should I say lack of innovation, because the initial response to Betfair when it came in, a very, very smart and sophisticated product, and I've got no allegiance to them, was to try and pillory them. And I think the phrase from a key, I think it was the head of the VRC at the time, was we could get jockeys' legs shot off and other crap that was spoken about it. No, it's just an exchange. It's no different to the stock exchange, where people look and read at information as to what they think values of companies should be. They think what the betting value of a horse should be. It teaches you things. Racing wanted to shut that down. And when it comes to things like Vince Accardi, and Jake, I promise you, on my kids, I'll never use your or anyone else's to run personal agendas. But the work I did with Vince Accardi, the reason I got to know him was we ran a digital channel on RSN, the Melbourne radio outlet, and the engagement we had from customers was so loyal, and they blew up so deluxe when it was stopped. And when you peel back all the personality clashes, you say, well, how could you want to stop something like that in the industry? And the reason is there's too much like cats pissing in their own corner, trying to say this is how it should be done, instead of embracing innovations, be it Betfair, be it the way Vince measures things, be it the way legends like Dominic Byrne approach the sport and teach people. As I said about the data lying, well, one of the big changes for me was hearing that both Dominic Byrne and Robbie Waterhouse barely look at replays. Well, someone's wrong, either me or them. I reckon it's me. And you got to say, well, how do we make data more available to people? How do we make the way Vince looks at racing differ to the way Dominic Byrne look at racing? They've got a lot of similar, or time form with Gary Crisp and all those type of things. So put as much information out there in the market, not, little vignettes and stories and all these other irrelevancies to punters. Because if you want people to be engaged when sports betting now is so sophisticated, well, you need racing information to be sophisticated to go with it.
Otherwise, the sport will keep rolling over and soon become an irrelevancy because it ain't that interesting watching animals ridden around in circles ridden by short people.
Yeah, it certainly seems that the idea of change isn't always embraced, and the idea of change at the moment, certainly from the outside and not being involved day to day, involves a marquee and some champagne and some American models / Instagram personalities. So it'll be interesting to see if the champion data of racing emerges in the next sort of 5 years, or it seems to be stagnating as it might be at the moment. So.
Well, Jake, but just on that point, Jake, it's, at least when it comes to the Instagram and the full marquees that the year-round punter sort of turns their nose at least racing's completely embraced then. I mean, that's a good thing. And even if it is via the fashion industry and via the as you say, the sort of, the marketing that's towards the party crowd, and I was one of them in my 20s, I was as stupid as anyone. But at least that is when racing is relevant and we own the back page, and even though it's getting intruded a lot on the AFL season with things like draft and post-season training, but at least racing is relevant during that time. My point that gets me really frustrated, you said racing doesn't embrace change. Worse than that, mate. Worse than that is that they actively go to shut down change. And that is a really bad thing for any industry.
So do you see horse racing as a long-term viable option for you as a sole trader? And would you have, I guess, the same answer if you were advising let's say a syndicate?
Look, I do think there's a long-term play, and part of that actually is what I just said about the Spring Carnival. I mean, I don't know. I don't like the self-insertion, but I'm self-inserting here. I've been, privileged to have a gig of emceeing the Melbourne Cup Parade. So the day before, in the centre of Melbourne, the whole city shuts down, and jockeys and trainers go through in a motorcade, and through come retired racehorses and fashion industry, and it's just awesome. So I'm happy to donate my fee to a charity for doing so, because I am privileged doing that, and I don't think it's something I necessarily earn. And in that case, you think, well, racing has got a future. When you see the champions come along, people want to embrace racing. Next week we'll have a country town, and it's a two-edged sword here because they embrace jumps racing, but a country town will be completely flooded with punters, mainly blokes. I think they call it over schoolies for over 40s, feeling Warrnambool. I won't be going there because I'll be posting my information, but I've done a few campaigns there, and it's so much fun. So there's so many different pockets of racing that the community want to embrace via the fashion industry, via betting, but racing needs to be smart about it. And as I said, their starting point needs to be our core business is that we're a wagering sport. We aren't a sport, so stop covering it as a sport. If a trainer's got a broken arm, why is that of interest to punters the next day that he's sporting a bandage on his arm? The punters want to know either why a horse ran so fast or why a horse didn't run so fast. That's the stuff that punters talk about to each other. At the moment, the coverage of the sport is talking a different language to what people who are engaged in the sport is, which is punters.
So you mentioned sports betting. Do you delve into sports betting at all? And if you don't, have you thought about it?
I don't. I'm fascinated by it. When we finish, I'll give you a name of someone who has completely embraced it. You might be a good podcast guest for you. But and he actually was a New York trader when the GFC hit, and he had clients saying, "Well, what do I do with my money?" And his starting point was, I couldn't be confident about any stock, but Federer's a moral at Flushing Meadow next week, and he did. He won the US Open. So I'm fascinated in the dynamics of it. I've probably, and this is only just a personal journey, but when I was full time in the AFL media, racing was my passion, my outlet, and now it's sort of flipped around. And also the team I support, Melbourne Footy Club, aren't as hopeless as we were for a few years, and genuinely look exciting. So. It's done the full flip for me. It's gone from my job to now my passion, because racing is my job and my outlet. So I don't like betting in that sort of sphere, but I'm very fascinated both with the dynamics of how the market moves and what racing can learn by what's happening in the sports betting areas and all the various quants and everything else that and algorithm traders And what sport don't do, even though I'm sure they'd be delighted if people never bet on their product, but what they don't do is actively try and shut down information, which is what the racing industry does. And that to me is a pretty bad irony, given that racing relies on wagering people being involved in sport. They rely on sponsorship, gate attendance, TV, media rights. They don't rely on people betting on the sport. Racing relies on people betting on it. So why they'd be thinking of shutting down or talking down that area is, to me, got me beat.
It does seem more and more like a major competitor. So it'd be interesting to see what does change, if anything, in the coming years on the sports side. Back to the racing side, do you have any, you mentioned Vince, but do you have any other mentors that you look to in the industry?
No, I'd say not. And one of the things I've done is completely shut myself out from listening or watching any racing media. I don't listen to any radio. I don't watch any TV shows anymore. Occasionally, I'll look at Sky Channel Sunday Morning Review mainly to keep in touch with the Sydney side of things, because obviously, at carnival time you have a few mixed form lines. But it frustrates me so much, and that's why. So I can't really consume it. I'll turn on the Victorian racing coverage before a race, and turn it on after a race. If I'm really engaged or want to see some kind of mounting yard coverage, I'll turn it on a bit earlier. And if I might have found a winner or want to hear a trainer or jockey interview post race, I'll leave it on a bit longer. But in general, I don't sort of consume any of that, and that helps me. It's really helped me because. I think it clouds your judgment, to be honest. If you're confident with the information you have in front of you, you don't want to hear what a trainer or a jockey thinks is going to happen. You're better off just looking at your own information, and sometimes it's done in all good faith. The trainer's tip, but it's going to bug you. I think it does with me. If a trainer says, "I'll tell you what, this horse is going to peak through its roof next start," they're really good at training. I just want to know that a horse is fitting well, and then and I'll give you a good example with I'm talking with a horse like Winks of Chris Waller's. I used to listen to him, and he'd torture himself over his own horses, and particularly his superstars. And you know what? That's his job. His job is to be so paranoid and to look at every single minute detail of how his animal is. As a punter, you don't need to hear any of that torture that the person whose reputation's on the line with making sure that his superstar turns up at its best. You just need to look at how fast the horse runs. And if you do, well, then you got a nice clear thinking, and then you walk into Cox Plate today with no doubt about how good she's going to be. And that's why I've, apart from, as I said, all personality clashes aside, I just found it easier to block out all the information, all the media talk, the noise, as it often gets called, and just look at the numbers.
Two more questions for you before you go. First one, any books or podcasts that you can suggest or you listen to or you read for the listeners out there?
Absolutely. So predictive analysis is a big thing. So I'd rather sort of look at things like that and then immerse myself in them from there. Now I'm just opening up because that's what it's called, Super Forecasting, the Art of Science of Prediction. I've got the audio book of that. I suppose because we're looking at screens all day, I actually prefer audio books and podcasts to go with it. So that's Philip Tetlock is the bloke who co-wrote that with Dan Gardner, and love all that stuff. And so I've really immersed myself into the predictive analysis side of things because, as I said, I don't really get much out of the racing media side of things. There's a guy called Nicholas Lavelle who has inspired a lot of the work I've done in something he calls the curve, and that is the importance of giving out good free information when you're trying to make money out of the free area. And so that's why I've embraced obviously Twitter and Facebook, and now I give out free newsletters on my service, my racetrackralphie.com.au service, and try and put really good information in it. I'll obviously plug stuff that I've got coming up, but I've got a lot of people who read my stuff, and they'll never become my customer. And I'm not worried about that anymore because of the work of Nicholas Lavelle. See Nassim Taleb stuff, and I enjoy that. I haven't read any of his books yet, but I have a lot of his YouTube stuff on. And obviously Michael Lewis, Moneyball, but also now he's done a book with Daniel Kahneman, and then you can. The great thing about YouTube, and particularly if you're doing what we're doing in the bunker, when you're sort of working away and looking at numbers, it's good to have a YouTube stuff on, and any of the Michael Lewis and Daniel Kahneman stuff on. Highly recommend. And just it probably all ties all this in a bow. I remember Michael Lewis in one of his interviews post Moneyball being asked about the kickback that he and Billy Bean, the baseball manager that he wrote about, got. And it was basically, people don't want to know that things they've been looking at and the ways they've been looking at things for 10 or 20 or 30 years has been wrong. I was lucky that I completely embraced the fact that I was wrong, and that's my personal journey. But the reality is sometimes things come along which are better, and Moneyball came along that was better for baseball, and there are different things that come along with racing that or wagering that's better for what we do. So that's what I really enjoy about blokes like Michael Lewis. And one last one, I suppose, is the Bill Simmons podcast. I completely immerse myself in it. He gets some great people on, even though he's American based, but he gets some guys on like I can't think of many, Chuck Klosterman and other guys. I just like the different thinking, the sports guys, and the lateral thinkers rather than racing stuff.
Yeah, Bill Simmons is certainly a great one. Harala Bob's on there, Cousin Sal. They have a good insight and a different insight onto what's going on, so I can certainly second that. I just wanted to get any contact details or anything you wanted to plug before you go. I know people might be interested in getting access to your website and the newsletter and your information. What's the best way they can go about doing that?
Yeah, my website's racetrackralphie.com.au, and I've got an app called Racetrack Ralphie. And I suppose just to finish with the reason for that stupid name is that it stuck. When I started at Triple M actually it was before that. I was in community radio back in 1991, particularly with the surname of Horowitz. Never mind Pauline Hanson. It was even more back then. It was a real white Australia policy in the media. I thought I'd better come up with something that doesn't have my surname in it. And whether that was paranoia or not, I don't know. But there was a guy called Hard Luck Harry, Brian Meldrum, who's Molly Meldrum's brother, and that was his moniker, Hard Luck Harry. And I thought I'd better come up with it. So I came up with the Racetrack Ralphie, and it stuck. And it sounded pretty cool when you're in your 20s, and now it sounds a bit stupid when I'm in my late 40s. But it's what I use, and at least people know I'm authentic. I suppose when I'm doing it, they know who I am, and it's a moniker that goes with my real name. But if they want to get in touch with me, they can via there, or my Twitter handle if they want to be part of the battle that I do there, which is RT Ralphie is my Twitter handle. But apart from that, I love engaging with people and bantering, and we get them right, we get them wrong, but we enjoy the battle.
Brilliant. I'm cognizant of your time, so I really do appreciate you coming on and having a chat. I had a dozen more things on my list. You mentioned there you got the app and the website, so the digital business in 2017 in the betting industry is something that we might have to have you on again to chat about in the future. But I do appreciate you coming on, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Good on you, Jake. It's been great fun.